can show you a support center that I think will be very beneficial for you to go to in the instances, let's say you want to refresh yourself.
Hello, and thanks for joining me today. My name is Angela, and I'm a child protection specialist with KidCheck. And today we're going to be talking about screening and the importance of it, and all the things that you can do around to help minimize easy access to children. So before we go ahead and get started, I wanted to share a few housekeeping details. First, I've got Alyssa on chat with me, and Alyssa will be sharing out lots of different links and information based on questions that are coming in. But I want to let you know I will try to take everyone's questions, but we're going to save the Q&A till the end because we do have a lot of information to get through today. So if you have a question, please put it in chat, and up on the right-hand side, you'll see a little circle. Go ahead and mark that with a Q so that we know that you have a question. Second, all of the information that is going to be presented today can also be found on the KidCheck blog. So if you miss something or there's something you want in more detail, have no fear. It's all out there on the blog as well. In addition to that, you'll be receiving a replay link for this video. So Alyssa will be sending that out within the next day or two, so it's available. And lastly, this is the second in our fall series of webinars. We have another one coming up relatively shortly that you'll definitely want to attend. It's about predator proofing your organization. And we talk a little bit about how predators operate, environments that they thrive in, red flags to look at, things like that. So make sure that you're looking for that, because that is a really good one to attend, and it kind of piggybacks off the information that we're going to be sharing today. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started. I am going to go out of this and go into my slide presentation. There we go. So volunteer and worker policies. We're going to be talking a little about everything that we present today will be about optimizing your environment for safety as it pertains to screening. So let's go ahead and get started. Why do we screen? Well, we screen because, unfortunately, the stats are not in our favor. There's a couple of reasons. If you look at these stats here today, it's really a glaring indication that we can know about people in our organization, but we really don't know people in our organization. So because the stats support a need to set up boundaries and remove easy access to children, screening is really one of those silver bullets that you really need to have a good process behind. So let's go ahead and go on. So we talk about culture as it relates to screening. And why does this matter? It matters because as a leader in your organization, if you are focusing on children and youth, you can't be everywhere at one time. You need to provide a culture that really creates an atmosphere where it's okay to communicate. If somebody sees something, they should say something. And we really refer to that as transparency. So as we're talking about screening, keep in mind ways that you can really encourage those that report to you or those that work with you to, if they see something, say something, having an open door policy, making sure that they know that consistency is key, that you're going to be looking at everything across the board as it pertains to child safety. Also, I want to talk about the last one where you're matching your volunteer requirements to the stage of your organization. What I mean by this is if you're a brand new organization, you want to spend some time really establishing a screening process. If you are an organization that's been around a long time and maybe screening is something that you've done a little bit but not too much of, this is a process where you really want to dig in and you really want to put forth a really good policy around. So we'll go ahead and talk a little bit more about that later, but keeping in mind that no matter where you are in the stage of your organization, you want to make sure that this screening process is solid, well-defined, and consistent across the board. And before we get started, I think it's important that I highlight a few of my assumptions as I'm presenting this information to you. So the first one would be that as we're talking about the screening process today and the 7 steps that we identify that make up a solid process, we're assuming that we're talking about adults that are 18 years or older. We're also going to assume that applicants are applying to work directly and consistently with children. So that's the second one. The third one is that the evaluation process or the screening policy that we're going to be talking about really is for those applying for either a paid position as a staff or an employee, or a volunteer who's working directly with kids, or someone in a leadership position who will have more control or say over the area of children. So I just wanted to highlight those assumptions really quickly before we go on. So what are the top risks to your organization if you don't have a clearly defined screening process? I think oftentimes false assumptions. We see and hear people often refer to, it will never happen in my organization because I know everybody that I hire, or I'm close friends or family, or however it might be. But those false assumptions can really set you up to take a fall. And so we want to get rid of that mindset that it will never happen in your organization. And we always want to be looking forward to how we can prevent something. Oftentimes, a huge risk is a lack of a child protection policy. Now, we'll talk a little bit about that later on, but that's a whole nother webinar in how you define and design your child protection policy. But that is a big risk if you don't have one. The third one, of course, what we're talking about today is incomplete vetting. If you're partially vetting people, but yet you're putting them over your most vulnerable, that puts you in a high-risk situation. And then the last but not least, I don't think it's lost on anyone. Everything that we see in the news today really speaks to allegations of sexual abuse. They are a huge risk to any organization focused on children and youth. So those are the top risks I wanted to highlight. The next, as we talk about screening, consider the top 2 stats. Less than 10% of child sexual abusers are ever criminally prosecuted or will ever see the inside of a courtroom. This, if you can remember back to how many we have existing, which was almost 1 million, that's a big number. The second one is the stat that I really want you to remember from this presentation. 90% of those that you will interview as candidates will have no red flags, marks, or any indications on their information that they could potentially pose a risk to your organization. That is a huge number, and the reason that we want to have your process of screening really solidified. So setting the foundation, what will screening provide you? I mean, you all can read this slide, but the couple that I want to highlight are the multi-dimensional screening from different perspectives. We'll talk a little bit about that more when we get into the interview or the face-to-face, but what screening does is it gives you a holistic picture of a candidate. In addition to that, it helps you to get feedback from others who are looking at this candidate, as well as retain feedback from references, both organizational and possibly personal. So the multidimensional perspective is really important. The other thing is that it bubbles up need-to-know information about character. And that is something that is hard for all of us to really determine when we really don't know someone. So the screening process really is helpful in that it will sort of bubble up things that may have some question behind them. And then the last, but it helps to save time for finding those that just aren't a good fit for your organization. And I think we've all been in situations where maybe we've seen a hire that wasn't a good fit and the repercussions of that. So screening really helps to eliminate those things. And also, of course, easy access to children, which is really, really important. So moving on, here are the 7 steps that we at KidCheck identify as a comprehensive screening process. We'll talk first about the written application, and it's important. It really is your foundational piece. And I want to make sure that I highlight that there's a large percentage of written applications that are turned in that are incomplete. And so I really want to raise that or bring that up to your awareness, is that you want to make sure that your written application is complete. Background check, of course, speaks for itself. We'll talk about that. The face-to-face interview. We'll talk some about getting comfortable with asking really intimate questions for candidates. And I want to remind you that we want to go back to the fact that these candidates are applying to work directly with children. So we're going to ask them different questions than if there's someone who is working in the background or who may never come into contact with children. We'll talk about references, the social media check, the motor vehicle report, which is definitely role specific. And then last but not least, for our friends in children's ministry, we'll talk about the waiting period. So let's go ahead and get started. The written application, it is your foundational piece that will drive every interaction you have with this candidate. So you want to make sure that it has a few things that are completely filled out. The first one I highlighted for you is the Social Security verification. That is really important and oftentimes not asked, but you really want to make sure that you have that available to you to verify. Also, any work experience with kids or youth is also a really good one to have completed on the application. And then your waivers, your background check and your social media waivers, because they will need to sign something to give you access to, one, look at their background and also their accounts. So you can kind of look at that and see those things that are extremely important in terms of the written application. But I just wanted to highlight those 3, as sometimes those are the ones most often left off. So going on to the next thing, the background check. For years, we really believed that the background check was the end-all be-all, that it was the silver bullet that would give you all the information that you could possibly need. Well, we know now, based on our current environment and how many actual allegations there are of sexual abuse, for those who have actually gone through a background check, it's really not the silver bullet. However, I will indicate that it is a very instrumental piece in your overall safety plan. And taking that background check and coupling it with screening gives you much more of a foolproof model for protecting those kids. A couple of questions that I often get is, how often do you repeat a background check? I would say for those working directly with children consistently, every year to 2 years. I highlight on this slide, it's about every 12 to 24 months. And, that's really important that you continue. Also, state checks versus federal checks. I'm a real believer that if you're going to have people working with children, you need to go all the way and go through the federal process for checking, because the federal evaluation will be very different than the state. And, with state, you can look at the local criminal records, but you can't look at the holistic picture of the entire country. So you really want to make sure that you go that extra mile and do a federal check. Now, I highlight on here that doesn't include federal or criminal cases in other states. The basic background check does not include that. So what the federal check requires are fingerprints, and that will give normally your local FBI office access to the criminal database, the sex offender registry, and the child abuse registry, which are pretty robust in some parts of our country and then pretty lagging in others. But if you have someone that is working directly with children, I encourage you to spend that extra money and really go to the federal level with that. All right, the face-to-face interview. I think this is probably a really important time for you to get an understanding. Body language speaks volumes especially when people are being interviewed. Now, one thing that I will tell you is that when we talk about predators, like in our next webinar, we talk a little bit about simply a face-to-face interview with a potential predator will deter them. Most of the time, predators will not sit through a face-to-face interview. And a lot of times it's because there's too many unknowns. They like to exist in the known space. So a face-to-face interview is really important. As you can see, I highlighted that it gives you the ability to gauge interest and commitment and even fit within your organization. It's a good indicator of where this person is currently at. But also, when it's conducted by 2 to 3 trusted staff members, these could be board members, these could be leaders in other functional areas, these could be potential parents who have maybe a history or experience in human resources or law enforcement or one of those things. Having those people sit in and evaluate a candidate from their perspective of expertise is really, really helpful. And, you know, I think I highlighted that on the slide is when you invite people to participate in these face-to-face, see if you can't focus on people with areas of expertise. You know, I just highlighted human resources or, you know, overall management or someone that has just a different professional perspective. It gives you the opportunity to share notes, to talk amongst yourselves about the importance of what they found, each person. And we know that the process for the face-to-face interview or even the whole screening process in general can be different for larger organizations. So if you're a large organization and you're onboarding hundreds of volunteers a quarter or a year, you'll need to fit the process, of course, to the stage of your organization or where it is. But we realize and we recognize that the process can be different for larger organizations versus smaller or startup or church plants and things like that. So keep in mind, you know, the process isn't rigid. It's definitely flexible, but there are some key things you really want to pull out. So let's go on to the next slide. The sensitive interview questions. This is always an interesting space because it's hard to ask sensitive interview questions. Nobody likes to feel uncomfortable or make someone feel uncomfortable, but this is a really important part of the overall face-to-face interview process. On this slide, I've highlighted a few that I found that fall mainly within legal limits for each state. But I think the first one is probably if you ask one sensitive question, I would encourage you to ask this question. And it is, have you ever been accused of, pled guilty to, or been a party to any childhood abuse, neglect, or any other crime against a minor? This, I think, is a very, very important question because, one, from the candidate's perspective, if they lie, if they answer it incorrectly, you know that throughout your process, you'll be able to find this information and you'll know they're not a good fit. The other thing is that it puts the candidate on notice that these are the things that you're going to be paying attention to. These are the questions that you ask anyone coming into contact with children. Another one I want to highlight is the question of, it's the third one down, and it says, have you ever mistreated or abused a child? I've seen some interviews where this question is asked, and it's amazing how the body language changes when a candidate gets very uncomfortable. So it can help you to determine there may be more behind this, or there may be something that the candidate would like to share, but possibly not at this time. So it gives you just a really good perspective on figuring out if there are any sensitive spots with this. So here are the interview questions. I just wanted to highlight a few. I could go deep into all of these, but I just, I wanted to make sure that you had something, if you don't already, to be able to use. Next, let's talk about personal references. Now, personal references are just an amazing opportunity to get information that you will not get from a candidate themselves. I say personal references, but I would encourage you to either split those between personal and organizational, or go all organizational and get references of people who have actually seen this candidate working with children and youth, who actually can tell you what they've seen from their perspective. And this is really helpful. And of course, we always have to highlight that you need to share with candidates that they cannot include relatives or blood relations, and they have to be somebody that can really highlight that past experience. A minimum of for 2 or 3, and then we oftentimes are shocked because I say 70% of the time references aren't contacted, but truly what we're finding is that it's really close to 80 to 90% of the time, because it takes time. And you know, I will share with you, often we hear with the screening process, organizations are afraid that if their screening process is too stringent, it will minimize their candidate pool, or people that they really want in there won't want to step up because of the rigorous process. But what I'm telling you is that those you want working with children will understand the benefit and the value of this process. So do not be afraid by having a very robust screening process available to evaluate candidates. It will not in any way, shape, or form eliminate that pool or decrease it. It will actually bring maybe fewer but more qualified candidates into you. So follow up with these references. And if you get a reference that the person says, you know, I'm just not comfortable answering this question about this candidate, you are within your rights to say that, thank you for sharing that. Can you provide a name and number of somebody who can answer these questions about the candidate? And then, you know, it gives you the open door for just gathering information and potential further questions as the candidate moves on to the next stages. So really focus on those personal references. They're often neglected, and they're just a great amount of information. So here we're going to talk about the final 3, the social media check. As you know, social media is huge within our culture, and it really is a very important indicator of where someone's life is, especially with children. I don't have the stat with me today, but when I was presenting a while ago with Alex, our KidCheck CEO, we talked about how oftentimes predators will post very, illicit photos, videos, different things on social media accounts, and not even really pay attention to it. So people going out to evaluate these candidates, if you see someone is tagged in a certain post, or someone likes a certain post that has to do with any sort of abuse or neglect or anything that has to do with children, that's a red flag. But having access to these accounts does differ in terms of each state. So you'll need to find out wherever you live what the requirements are and for doing a social media check. But it really is a great indicator and can really reveal a lot about a potential candidate. Also, on the flip side, I will tell you that there have been times when social media checks have highlighted areas of opportunity or skill or talent that the candidate never highlighted in their application. I was talking with one person at a conference one time, and she shared with me that it was the first time that they had enacted social media checks. And this girl was coming in to be a children's ministry director. And she had filled out all the applications, she had done the process, and they were doing this social media check, and they found out that she had this whole other background in music and her ability to teach music, and had won awards for different, music activities. And she said, the social media aspect really bubbled up a whole nother side of this candidate that we didn't even know existed. And we were so glad we found it, because then we were able to apply budget to bring forth a music program that we had never even planned on. So on the flip side of revealing not so great information, social media can be a great way to find out about more skills and talents for your candidates. So just keep that in mind. The last one, or the second to the last one, the motor vehicle report. I think is really important because for a couple of reasons. The motor vehicle report really can indicate things that are often not found on criminal records. And what I mean by that is in some states, DUIs, reckless driving, things like that are often not found in criminal records, but they can be highlighted through a motor vehicle report. I did mention early that this was role specific, and of course it is. If you have a candidate who's going to be transporting children to and from your site or to other events and activities, obviously you would want to run a motor vehicle report. But one of the best things about the motor vehicle report is truly how fast it is. So it gives you a lot of information that you may normally have to wait for. You know, things like use of drugs or alcohol, risky driving behaviors, recklessness. The motor vehicle report really just brings forth all that information, and they're quick. So keep in mind that that might be something that if you don't currently utilize, it's really a good information tool. The last thing, establish a waiting period. This really refers to our volunteers, or those within churches and children's ministry organizations. We really encourage those organizations, because they're bringing in a lot of volunteers oftentimes, to kind of have a wait and see approach. Seeing if this person, one, is a good fit for your organization, how they interact with other people attending, how they respond to leadership, how involved they are with the kids. It just gives you a little bit of time to really make a stronger decision. So we always talk about that waiting period. I've heard waiting periods that exist anywhere from 2 weeks on up to 6 months. So it really is organizational dependent upon where you're comfortable lying. So just know that 2 weeks to 6 months, anywhere in between, if you're bringing in volunteers to work with large groups of kids, that waiting period really does. It's a separate indicator of a lot of really good information. So that concludes our 7 steps for screening. But now let's talk a little bit about youth. And I get this question a lot. And people want to know, well, if they're 18 years and under, how do I evaluate them? Well, my suggestion is you go through the same exact screening process minus the background check. And the reason that is because probably most parents won't sign the waiver for you to do a background check, but we do see an increase in youth being tried as adults. So you really want to make sure that if you're pulling volunteers from any sort of a youth organization inside or outside of your environment, you want to make sure that they go through a very rigorous vetting process. You never want to put minors in charge of other minors. This is just never a good idea. You know, when we talk about younger children, we often refer to the role of twos, and really that role of twos can the rule of two can really roll across several different age groups. And a minor should always be in the company of 2 completely vetted, non-related adults. They should always be overseeing the minor for children. So very important. And, you know, oftentimes I think that it gives youth a really good experience in the whole interviewing process anyways. And most times we see parents who are more willing to say, yeah, this is what the real world looks like. You have to fill out applications. You have to go through an interview, a vetting process. You have to tell people why you want this role, you know. So it's just really important that youth have that same standard applied to them as we do with adults. And, you know, as I highlighted on the screen, we have seen a major increase in peer-on-peer abuse, double digit as I highlight, over probably the last 3 to 5 years. So the numbers really speak to the fact that we really have to start putting up more barriers to prevent easy access to children. And we can really start by applying this process to youth as well. All right. So how do we bring this all together? Where do we go from here? I wanted to highlight training and development because it should be a process that never ceases within your organization. Training and development should always be a top priority as it relates to children's safety and protection. Whether you choose to do a massive training twice a year or once a year or every week for 10 minutes, you constantly want to be talking about the process of child safety, your policies that you have attached to that. And also, if you've spent all this time identifying people that are good fits for your organization, you really want to make sure you continue to develop them. So you want to make sure that you're always working towards training and developing your volunteers, your staff, leadership, possibly sharing your materials like your child protection policy or your safety plan or current guidelines if anything has changed. We have seen in organizations that really prioritize ongoing training and development, we have seen a decrease in incidents, especially around abuse. And we know that by training and getting everyone on the same page, you really do create a much safer environment. And also, it just helps people to be able to, when they see something, say something and know what they're seeing. So it just really minimizes that gray area when you're interacting with children. So big fan of training and development. If it's not within your plan, you should probably take a look at that. Child protection policy, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, this is also a whole nother webinar. And, child protection policy can be extremely daunting. And I often let people know that if you're feeling overwhelmed with this, or if you have one currently that you know needs to be updated, there's lots and lots of resources out there to help you. In addition to what we share on the KidCheck blog for child protection plans, there's also great training organizations. We partner with one, Plan to Protect. They're a great organization for training and development and policy creation, and they will help sort of put it all in perspective for you. So keep in mind that when we talk about child protection policy, we're really talking about a set of guidelines that your organization intends to utilize in how it's going to care for children. And, the goal of the child protection policy is always to decrease isolation and increase accountability. And what that means is that every policy guideline that you create within your overall CPP needs to lend to those two things, decreasing isolation and increasing accountability. I've already spoke about the rule of twos, and that is once again an example of a policy guideline that you often find within child protection policy. And that basically states that a single child should never be alone with an adult, that there should always be two sets of eyes on every situation. And we can get more into that rule, but that's just one I wanted to highlight for you. And there are so many benefits to creating a solid child protection policy. I've highlighted a few there, but I want to call out that it really does help limit your liability, and it provides a layer of protection for your organization and for those that you serve. And so it's very important. So keep in mind, out on the blog, there's tons of information. I think there's a whole series out there actually on creating or updating your child protection policy. So hopefully that can help whatever stage you're in. So going to the next one, bringing it all together. We've talked about the screening process. We've talked about the essential components of it. We've highlighted the child protection policy. We've talked about training and development. A couple of things I just want to mention is that when you bring this all together, you really want to share this news. You always want to be talking about the things that you're doing to help increase child safety. Whatever it looks like, it needs to be shared with parents in your organization. It needs to be shared with peers, with leadership. It needs to be constantly talked about, because it's those organizations who put forth that immediate discussion on here's our vision for child safety and protection that really is helpful in deterring any bad behavior. Also, I already belabored training and educating people and informing them on your policies, how they fit in, how they can identify red flags, but people aren't going to know that. They need to be trained on that. So that's very important. The next thing is being prepared to answer questions. If you're taking steps through screening, or through maybe it's even just incorporating background checks or training or creating your CPP, you want to be able and be prepared as a leader to answer questions. Why are you doing this? How is this helping your organization? You want to be able to speak to budget. Is this cutting into your budget? Are you having to reallocate dollars for things like federal background checks? Are you shifting funds around? But what is the ultimate goal of what you're trying to accomplish? It's so important for leadership to be able to answer those questions, because it helps to really solidify what you're doing and where you're going. So, and last but not least, I always have to say, follow up with those that are an extension of your organization. Talk with parents. Talk with children. You know, we have a post out on the blog that talks about doing an annual survey that actually includes children's feedback. Those are things that you want to make sure you're constantly doing, because that feedback is so important. Whether it's weekly staff meetings where you're getting feedback from those that are reporting directly to you, whether it's in your leadership meetings and you're following up with other parts of the organization, whether it's your once a year presentation to your board or leadership team, whatever that looks like, make sure you're following up, answering your questions, and providing the information. I can't tell you how often we see pushback, because anytime you change a process or you enact a policy like screening, you're going to get a little bit of pushback. But if you're able to answer these questions and you're constantly taking in feedback, you're going to minimize that quite a bit. So connect with us. If you want more information, I've already belabored the blog a few times, but all of this information in more detail is located out on the KidCheck blog. Please also follow us on social media. We share a lot out there about what we're doing, tips, tricks, product updates, all kinds of stuff. So really try to connect with us on social media, and here's some resources for you to be able to connect with us. And then last but not least, if you ever have a security question or you ever need direction, we take in a lot of different emails from people who just need direction or have a question or need a resource. We're always here and available for that. Alex isn't with me today. I feel like I'm missing an arm, but his email is up there also. So feel free to reach out and contact us with that. So I'm going to go ahead and let's go into the Q&A. I'm going to get situated here so that you can see me. And I'm going to look and see what we've got going for chat. Going down to the bottom, it looks like our first question is from Teresa, and she asks, what exactly is the social media waiver? A social media waiver is essentially a release form that indicates you have the opportunity to look at someone's social media accounts that they list, whether it's Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. They give you access to say, you can go out and look at that information and you can use that in my vetting process. So that is what a social media waiver is intended to do, is to just give you legal access to look at a person's activity online. So I hope that answered the question. Let me go down to the next one. Here's a question from David. He said, what's the recommended minimum age of youth serving in kids ministry, but not a supervisor role, i.e. sound, worship team, etc.? Great question, David. And I would tell you that that is organizational dependent. So some organizations will take kids 16 to 18 years of age. It's really dependent upon the role and what your organization is comfortable with. So I would really encourage you, if you don't have a minimum age limit identified for volunteer opportunities within your ministry, that you seek out other leaders and try to establish one, because I've seen it all over the map, and it's all different for different types of organizations. So you really should establish that, but usually it's 18 and under is the catch-all that I've seen. All right, this comes from Wendy, and it says, is it a concern if someone says no to the social media waiver? Of course it's a concern, and it's a big red flag. And that's where you have an opportunity to explain why you're requesting the social media waiver. I feel like if it would be as if somebody turning in an incomplete application. So if someone says no to your social media waiver, I would highly recommend that you really consider taking that candidate off the table. And but knowing that, you know what, sometimes stuff is exaggerated on social media. Sometimes something can be presented that's not an accurate depiction of the person or their views or their experience, explaining to the candidate that it's an opportunity for them to look a little deeper and why this is so important, especially when you're working directly with children. So that would be my recommendation for you. The next question is from Sandra. How do you get access to their social media? You have to friend them. Oftentimes, if it's a private account, you're correct. You do have to friend them. But if their accounts are all private, you can give them the option of giving you access to one or two, or, yes, you do have to friend them, and they do have to let you see them. So oftentimes too, I know that there are now services within background check organizations that can do professional social media checks for you. Especially if you're not comfortable friending someone in that manner, there are services that will do that for you. So that might be a situation where you enact a service like that if you go out and you see that all accounts are private. So just food for thought. I know Plan to Protect has a really solid social media waiver. I think I might have a copy of that. So I could probably share that when Alyssa sends out the link to the replay. We can go ahead and see if we can attach that. So you can just take a look at it and see how it fits for your organization. Okay, let's go on. I don't know how, see, Amanda, my question below. Sherry says, we recruit over 100 volunteers each year. How can I modify the face-to-face interview? Sherry, that's a great question, and we hear that a lot. Here is my suggestion for modifying that face-to-face interview process. What we have found is that if you do all the face-to-faces in one day and you keep them to a 15-minute period, people who you're bringing in for your interview team can usually set aside a couple of hours to do multiple candidates. So, and sometimes we've seen organizations say, today is our interview day. We're doing a solid 8 hours. We have different teams of people coming in. They sort of segment it that way. So if you've got a lot of volunteers coming in, trying to really hone it down to a couple of days or some specific time periods and really ratcheting that down to 10 or 15 minutes. And once again, utilizing people who have professional expertise in the area that you need, they'll be prepared with really direct questions. So that process can be quickly gone through if you're doing a lot of people. And I've also heard of other organizations really honing down the pool. So when you go into interview face-to-face, you're doing your top 5 or possibly your top 7. You're not doing your top 20. You're hopefully culling that down so that to make the face-to-face interview a lot less longer in terms of the time period required. All right, I don't see any other additional questions from anyone. Let me check make sure. Oh, new questions, there are more. Let me see. Okay. So David asks, we use Protect My Ministry for our local, state, national checks and abuse training. PA has different laws. Yes. Well, that's not a question, but David, I'm glad that you highlighted that because PA kind of sets the gold standard. We see a lot of legislation in different states really heading towards where Pennsylvania is, what they're doing, and for good reason. It says there's a question. Do you have a simple, this question comes from Erica. Do you have a simple solution as to how to run a nationwide federal child abuse screening? Do you have a simple solution as to how to run a nationwide federal child abuse screening? What I would suggest on that one is once again going to your local FBI office who takes fingerprints and actually can get access to those national registries. I know that there are some background check organizations that do have access to the national registries, not just the database, but the registries. But I don't have those at the top of my mind. I could find them out for you. But if you want to do something quickly and you do have a local FBI office, that's usually what I suggest to people is really utilizing that office or a service like Protect My Ministry. This comes from Wendy, is there a website background check that you could recommend for state and federal, especially if they have lived in another state? There is no website, but there is, actually I take that back. I do have a resource for a national website. I don't have that at the top of mind, but I'll make sure that I do send that to you, Wendy, because there are some different resources out there available who can give you information on more of a national background check and what that includes. And you know, unfortunately, our background check, process as a country is it's just all over the map. It's not very consistent. So depending on where you are, we'll get a resource for you for your location and state. Okay, let's see. We asked that. Hi, joining. Let me see. Erica. We are a small company that provides on-site temporary childcare programs during conferences and conventions nationwide. We hire temporary local caregivers to work with us during a local program, looking for a simple solution for child abuse background check. Well, what I will highlight in this is, you know, I normally, for those types of events, being able to have a process where you can access mobile information, background checks that for temporary use and things like that is really, really important. I know within our system of KidCheck, we do have some great mobile resources for you. So I'm not sure if you're interested in check-in as well as the background check and those combined together, but we do provide some clarity there in that. So if we can get with you and talk a little bit more about our vet management and how it pertains with check-in and background check and mobile access, that would be great. I think that would be really helpful, especially for your temporary use people. Let's see. Could you tell us the difference between the national background check Protect My Ministry does and the federal FBI check? From what I've heard, the federal FBI check goes several layers deeper than what organizations like Protect My Ministry are able to provide. Now, I've never been able to verify that, but that is what I've heard from other sources, was that going through federally through an organization like the FBI just provides more information. Now, things could have changed with Protect My Ministry. They could have access to more information. I would certainly ask those questions of your background check providers and also your local FBI office and see where they fall and see what the benefits are of that. Because I know the Sex Offender Database Registry and the Child Abuse Registry are two that the FBI does have access to that organizations like Protect My Ministry may not. So that's where I think the clarification and the distinction comes. Let's see. This comes from Charles. What if the person is not on social media? Will that be a red flag? I don't necessarily think so. I have never seen a situation where a person wasn't active on social media and that was a red flag. But what I will tell you is that's where the references come in. That's where people's feedback of an individual and actually have seen their working with youth and children is really important. So if they're not on social media and you can't get any of that information from them, being able to use those references to provide that information is really valuable. And that's why I always say follow up on your references, because they are a treasure trove of information for people, especially if they're not living out loud on social media. It gives you just an opportunity to be able to find out more about their lives and how they interact with children. So let me see here. Let me keep going. This one, check. Regarding confidentiality of the background checks, who should have access to the background reports, and what are the best practices preventing leaks about information which may show up in a background check? Well, I will tell you, Chuck, that's a fantastic question. And also something I wanted to highlight for the written application as well is for written applications, for sensitive information about applicants and candidates, you want to make sure that very few people have access to that information. Second, that it is either locked in digital form or physically in a file cabinet with someone someone within leadership having the key, because that is really important to keep that information confidential. And the fewer amount of people that have access to it, you're going to minimize your leaks. So I would say for us at KidCheck, we have a process for storing background information within our tool. So that's there. But outside of the tool, I would say being able to have it stored digitally with very few people that have access to it really. And like with Protect My Ministry, they send you the report, but you can then save that. And if you have a human resource files or department or something, making sure that you always know where that is and kept safe is really, really important. It's an important practice to really integrate into your screening process. Let's see. Okay. I don't see any more questions. So if there are any, please feel free to ask them now. Other than that, let's see. It says, does our organization have to be approved to request the FBI background checks on applicants? I'm not exactly sure, Lucinda, what you're referring to in terms of being approved, but if you're an established church or business, you should be able to access anything that the FBI has available to them. So by way of checking, but I would double check on that. I've never heard of an organization having to be approved in order to use those services, but I could be incorrect. So make sure you ask those questions of them and just find out. And if the FBI can't service you for any reason, I would ask them who could and what they would recommend at the federal level for doing those checks. All right. It looks like I've hit everything. Once again, I just want to say thank you so much for joining me today. This is such an important topic, and I really appreciate everybody being available and being interested in it. Once again, I want to highlight we do have in the near future another presentation coming up, which will be focused more on predators and how to predator-proof your organization. In that webinar, we'll talk a little bit more about predator characteristics, how they operate, environments where they thrive. We'll talk about red flags, being able to see those. We'll talk about some key, just some key things that predators look for in organizations. And let me see, 1 second. It looks like Alyssa, we have some from Amanda and Lisa above. Let me see. Amanda and Lisa, I certainly don't want to forget you. So I see a question from Lisa that says, how does this apply to small churches? And I'm assuming that you're referring to the screening process. If that's the case, I will tell you that it's on I am here. Let me take a look. Okay. Amanda and Lisa, I'm so sorry. I'm not getting all of your questions. I can't quite see them all in chat from Melissa. But if you're talking about how does the overall screening process apply to small churches, I would say that more than anything, the screening process applies to small as well as the largest churches. So who does the social media check are you referring to? I would say that who's ever in charge of doing the social media or doing the overall interviewing process, that's who needs to do the social media check. But one thing that I would recommend with a social media check is that if you're going to do it, interview the candidate first and then do your social media check, and then follow up with any questions that you might have that are raised from the social media check. So, and I say this because I have seen certain situations where information shared on social can tend to bias someone. And so, like I said, I would do the interview process and then do the social media check and follow up with any questions that arise from that. So it just helps with gaining an accurate perspective of a person. So Alyssa, oh goodness, your things are going away. Here's a new one. We are a gym and we have a childcare with parents that leave their kids in our childcare for 2 hours, and we have swimming lessons. We use young instructors. Would this apply to us as well? Absolutely. Anytime this process is for anyone who is consistently and directly getting access to children. No matter what kind of an organization you have, you want to enact this process, at least a screening process that does a background check, that does reference checks, that does the social media check, simply because you want to do your due diligence, especially if you're leading an organization focused on children and youth. We're seeing so much come forth that you want to make sure that due diligence is done so that if anything comes back, it protects you. It provides that layer of protection for you and your organization that you vetted this person, and especially those with consistent and direct contact to children, no matter what you're doing. Let me see. We just got a question from Rebecca. What would be your recommended age difference between youth workers and the minors they are with? My recommended age difference doesn't exceed 4 years. So there's been some studies done that show anything more than a 4-year gap sort of shifts the balance of power. So if you're going to have minors working with children, I would make sure that they're within that 4-year span of that. And, we also have, there's a graph out on the KidCheck blog that talks about staffing requirements and for regular volunteers as well as for youth. I would connect in with that because it's a pretty sizable chart, but it gives you a lot of information about those requirements, those staffing requirements, age requirements, and things like that. So check that out, because that will be a great resource for you. Okay, did I get them all, Alyssa? I'm not sure. All right, no more questions. Well, thank you for your patience with me as I was wading through the questions. I appreciate everyone's comments and discussion. This has been great. Once again, utilize our email addresses if you need to ask any questions. I'm going to put those up again so you can make sure you can get those. Alyssa will be also providing a link for you. And then there they are. There is my email address as well as Alex Smith. So please feel free to reach out. Thanks again for your time, and we look forward to speaking with you at the next webinar. Take care.